Harlem, 1946. A mob boss dropped a coffin on Bumpy Johnson's street, silver bullet inside. 6 names carved into the wood. A public humiliation in front of the entire neighborhood. But within 3 days, every one of those 6 men vanished without a trace. So what exactly did Bumpy Johnson do that made that mob boss pack up and leave New York forever, to understand how it all led here? We go back to Lenox Avenue, 2:17 a.m., the night that coffin arrived. The cold that hit Harlem in October 1946 wasn't normal cold. It smelled like rust and wet concrete and something else. Something underneath. Something rotting. The kind of cold that makes the back of your neck tighten before your brain understands why. Bumpy Johnson stepped out of his building on 118th Street at 7 in the morning, pulled one breath of that air into his lungs, and stopped walking. Something was wrong. He couldn't name it yet, but 20 years in these streets had built a second set of senses in him, something animal. Something that processed danger before language could catch up. He stood on the sidewalk and lit a cigarette and watched Lenox Avenue move through the cold morning light. Women heading to work, a dog pulling against a leash, 2 men unloading crates from a truck. Normal. All of it normal, and completely wrong. The first runner came to him at 8 o'clock, a 19-year-old kid named Roosevelt. Thin, quick-eyed, the kind of boy who understood that in this business, being fast with information was the difference between being useful and being invisible. He found Bumpy in the back room of the barber shop on 121st and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. 2 men, Roosevelt said, big, white shirts despite the cold. One of them had a scar across his chin like someone took a knife to him and changed their mind halfway through. They walked into Mr. Dubois' shop this morning, stood at the counter, and took $40 out of the register without saying a single word. Bumpy looked at him. Dubois say anything? No, sir. Did they threaten him? Roosevelt hesitated. They didn't have to. The second runner arrived 20 minutes later. Then a third, all of them with the same story. Different blocks, different faces, same method, no demands, no threats, just men walking into spaces that belonged to Harlem and taking what they wanted. Calm as if they'd been doing it for years. Bumpy finished his cigarette, lit another, said nothing. That afternoon he called in Junie Bird. Junie was 26 years old, and built like a man who had fought his way out of every room he'd ever been in. He had a mouth that moved fast and eyes that missed nothing, and a loyalty to Bumpy that had been tested enough times to be considered fact rather than feeling. He dropped into the chair across from Bumpy without waiting to be invited and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Tell me, Bumpy said. They've been out there a week. Junie said, maybe longer. The old men outside the barber shop, the ones who sit there every single day and watch everything they said. These faces started showing up 8, 9 days ago, just standing at first, watching corners, counting foot traffic. He paused, like they were drawing a map. Bumpy said nothing. One of them went into the numbers spot on 123rd. And stood there for 10 minutes looking at everything in the room before he walked out. Didn't take $1. Just looked. Junie's jaw tightened, like he was memorizing it. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and hair oil, and the faint metallic bite of cold air coming in under the door. Somewhere outside. A woman was shouting at someone in Spanish. A car horn. The flat slap of shoes on wet pavement. Find out who sent them, Bumpy said. Don't touch them. Don't approach them. Watch and report. Bumpy. Watch, Bumpy said. The word landed like something dropped on concrete. Junie closed his mouth, nodded once. Left. Carlo Moretti called at 6 that evening from a payphone, always a payphone. Never a traceable line. because Moretti had survived 20 years between two worlds by treating paranoia as a lifestyle. His voice was careful and clipped, the voice of a man who weighs every syllable before releasing it. "These men are not from the neighborhood," Moretti said. "They did not come from our side. Nobody authorized a move against you. I need you to understand that." "Then somebody's freelancing," Bumpy said. "Somebody is testing you," Moretti said, "and they chose a very deliberate way to do it." Bumpy hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. He understood what was happening. This was not a robbery. This was a message written in small provocations. Take a little money here. Disrespect a shop owner there. Let the neighborhood see it happen, and let Bumpy's silence be interpreted as weakness. It was the oldest move in the book. Apply pressure slowly, consistently, until the structure cracks from the inside. He'd used it himself, twice. The answer came 2 days later, and it came brutally. Darnell was 18 years old and had been running policy slips for Bumpy for 4 months. He was found behind the Alhambra Theater on 126th Street at 11 at night by a woman walking home from her shift at the hospital. Both his arms were broken, not fractured. Broken, snapped at the forearm like someone had put them across something hard and come down with their full weight. 3 ribs, a gash across his forehead from something blunt and metal. He was conscious when they found him. He was making a sound that the woman who found him never forgot and never talked about again. Detective O'Malley got the call and drove out personally. He stood over Darnell in the alley with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the boy on the wet concrete, and his face showed nothing. Not shock, not sympathy, not even the professional interest of a man encountering a puzzle. Just a blank, practiced absence of reaction that said he had already heard enough rumors to know exactly what this was and had already decided how much of it he wanted to involve himself in. Bumpy arrived 20 minutes after O'Malley. The alley smelled like garbage and old rain and copper blood mixing with the puddles, spreading thin and dark across the cracked asphalt. Bumpy crouched beside Darnell and put one hand on the boy's shoulder, very gently, and spoke to him in a low voice that nobody nearby could hear. Whatever he said. Darnell's breathing slowed slightly. His eyes found Bumpy's face and stayed there. Bumpy stood. His face was stone. Junie was right behind him, breathing hard through his nose, hands clenched at his sides. "Say the word," he said. His voice was barely controlled. "Just say it." Bumpy looked at him. "Not yet. He's 18 years old. I know how old he is," Bumpy said. Quiet. Final. The kind of quiet that ends conversations permanently. Junie stepped back. He understood. He didn't like it. But he understood. The strong do not strike the moment they're cut. They wait until their enemy has walked so far into open ground that there is nowhere left to run. Some of what happened in that alley was never put into any official report. O'Malley drove away 30 minutes later and did not return. The old numbers men who heard about Darnell said the strangers had been operating openly for a full week before anyone brought it to Bumpy. Every one of those men had the same question. Not about the strangers, about why it took so long to report. Nobody had an answer. Not yet. At 2:17 in the morning, a truck with no license plates rolled slowly down Lenox Avenue and stopped in front of Bumpy Johnson's building. 2 men climbed out of the back. They didn't rush. They moved with the deliberate, unhurried efficiency of men who had done this before, or had been told exactly what to do, and had thought about it long enough to stop being nervous. They set down a coffin, black lacquer, heavy, expensive, directly in the center of the street. Then they climbed back into the truck, and the truck drove away without its headlights, and Lenox Avenue was quiet again. By 5:38 a.m., the laundry woman on the 3rd floor of the building across the street saw it from her window and gripped the curtain so hard the rod bent. She thought she was dreaming. She stood there for 3 full minutes before she understood she wasn't. By 6 a.m., the old men had gathered at their corner and were standing in complete silence, looking at the black box in the middle of the street with the particular stillness of men who know that some things should not be spoken about too quickly. By 7 a.m., a crowd had formed, not close. Nobody moved close, standing in the October cold, with their breath making small clouds in the air, watching the coffin the way you watch a fire you cannot put out. Children pressed against their mothers' coats. A dog barked twice at it and then backed away and refused to bark again. The coffin sat there in the thin morning light, gleaming, enormous, absolutely still. Bumpy came down at 7:15. He was shaved. His coat was buttoned. He walked out of his building and crossed the sidewalk and stood in front of the coffin without expression, without hesitation, without the flinching body language of a man who has been surprised. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he stepped forward and opened the lid. The inside smelled like fresh lacquer and something else, something chemical, sharp, like cleaning solvent. Resting on black velvet in the center of the coffin was a single silver bullet. One. Set there precisely, intentionally, like a period at the end of a sentence, and carved into the interior of the lid deep gouges, made with a blade, and patience and deliberate pressure were 6 marks. 6 straight lines, evenly spaced, cut so deep the wood had split slightly at the edges. Bumpy stood very still. He counted the marks, then counted them again, then looked at them without counting. Just looked. The way you look at something that has rearranged your understanding of the world. 6 marks, 6 names, not random, specific. The 6 people in his operation who knew everything, the routes, the collection points, the drop locations, the contacts, the schedules, the 6 people whose knowledge, in the wrong hands, could dismantle Harlem's numbers operation from the inside in a matter of days. Someone had named them, someone who knew exactly who they were. He closed the lid, straightened, turned to the 2 men standing nearest to him. "Leave it where it is," he said. People expected him to have it moved. A threat this public, this humiliating, the natural response was to erase it, get it off the street, restore the image of control. Every logical instinct said move the coffin. Bumpy left it in the middle of Lenox Avenue all day. Mothers dragged their children past it. Delivery trucks slowed and swerved around it, and the drivers stared. The number runners did their routes and came back and reported to Junie, who stood near the coffin all morning, cataloging every face that stopped to look. He saw curiosity. He saw fear. He saw, on a few faces, just a few. Just briefly, something that looked like satisfaction. He memorized those faces. Carlo Moretti drove past at 2 in the afternoon, slow enough to see clearly. He did not stop. He kept his eyes forward and his hands steady on the wheel. And the man sitting beside him in the passenger seat said nothing, because Moretti's face had closed entirely, like a door shutting. And when Moretti's face did that, you did not speak. Father Callahan walked past at 4 o'clock, on his way back from a hospital visit. He stopped. He stood before the coffin with his hands folded and his lips moving slightly. And a woman nearby asked him what he was praying for. "Clarity," he said. His voice was completely even. He walked on. At dusk, Bumpy had the coffin brought inside, not because the day had frightened him, because the day had done its work. Every person in Harlem had seen it. Every contact across the city had heard about it. Every man on both sides of the line now understood that someone had made a direct and public move against Bumpy Johnson, and that Bumpy Johnson had left it in the street like it was beneath his concern. He had it carried to the basement, set down carefully under the single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. He opened the lid again and looked at the 6 marks for a long time. The basement smelled like mold and old brick and the sharp lacquer rising off the coffin wood. Water dripped somewhere behind the wall. The bulb hummed. 6 marks. Specific names. Inside knowledge. The man who sent the coffin was not the real problem. Junie appeared in the doorway. "You know what it means?" he asked. Bumpy looked at the marks. "Yes." He did not look up. He did not elaborate. The single syllable landed in the damp basement air and stayed there. The greatest fear is not what threatens you from the outside. The greatest fear is what has already been placed in plain sight for everyone to see, including the people who put it there. People who were in Harlem that day remembered the coffin for the rest of their lives. Most of them said the truck had no plates. That part, at least, everyone agreed on. The Starlight Lounge on 133rd Street went dark at 9 o'clock. No announcement. The bartender, a large quiet man named Samuel who had worked that room for 11 years, simply stopped pouring. He set down the bottle, looked at the 3 remaining customers, and crossed his arms. No words. The customers looked at his face, looked at each other, and left. The door closed. Samuel bolted it, turned off the front lights, and went to the back. By 9:30, the only light in the building was a single lamp in the corner booth, the last booth, against the back wall, angled so that anyone sitting there could see both the front door and the rear entrance simultaneously. The kind of positioning that had kept men alive in rooms like this since rooms like this existed. Bumpy sat there with a glass of water in front of him. He hadn't touched it. The ice had melted. The room smelled like spilled beer and cigarette smoke baked into the wood over decades. And underneath that, faintly, the sweet rot of something that had once been fresh and wasn't anymore. The kind of smell that lives in old Harlem buildings the way memories live in old men permanently. Below the surface. Impossible to remove. Carlo Moretti came through the back door at 9:45. He was wearing a gray overcoat too thin for October, and the cold had done something to his face, tightened it, pulled the skin close to the bone, left him looking older than he was. He moved through the dark room without turning on any additional lights and sat down across from Bumpy without offering his hand or saying hello. 2 men who have worked together long enough stop performing the rituals of trust. They either have it or they don't. "You drove past it today," Bumpy said, not a question. "Yes." Moretti put both hands flat on the table. They were steady. "I have been on the telephone every hour since, calling every contact I have on both sides, asking one question: who authorized this? And nobody." Moretti held the word out like evidence. "Not one person I spoke to, and I spoke to people who would know. People who cannot afford to lie to me about something like this. Not one of them knew anything about a coffin, about any move against you at all." Bumpy said nothing. Let the silence work. "This did not come from the syndicate," Moretti continued. His voice was controlled, but underneath it, carefully buried, was something that might have been fear. "A move this public against you would require authorization at a level that takes weeks to arrange. Nobody was asked. Nobody approved it." He paused, "which means someone is freelancing, and they want it to look like it came from us." "So that I come for you," Bumpy said, "and you come back at me. And whoever is actually behind this walks into Harlem while we're bleeding each other out." "Yes." Bumpy looked at him. "Old play." "Old play," Moretti agreed, "but it requires someone who understands both sides well enough to set it up. The timing, the visibility, the specific nature of the provocation." He stopped, looked at the table. "The marks." Bumpy said nothing. 6 marks, Moretti said quietly. "That is not a random number. Whoever chose 6 knew what 6 meant. He looked up. That level of specific information does not exist outside your inner circle. No, Bumpy said, it doesn't. The jazz trumpet that had been drifting in from a window somewhere above them finally stopped. The silence that replaced it was absolute, the kind of silence that has weight. Moretti reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table between them. He did not push it toward Bumpy. He simply left it there, in the space between them, like something that now belonged to both of them and neither of them. A name came up, he said, twice, from 2 sources who have no knowledge of each other, men who would have no reason to tell me the same lie. He met Bumpy's eyes. In this business, when the same name comes from 2 separate directions, it is not coincidence. Bumpy looked at the paper. He let it sit there for a moment, not from hesitation, but from the particular discipline of a man who has learned that the last second before knowing something is the last second of a certain kind of peace. He picked it up, unfolded it, read the name. His face gave nothing, not a flicker, not a tightening around the eyes or a shift in his jaw, or any of the 1,000 small betrayals the human face commits when it encounters a truth it wasn't prepared for. He read the name, folded the paper, put it in his breast pocket. "Who else knows you came here tonight?" he asked. "No one. I walked 6 blocks from a payphone." "Good." Moretti left at 10:30 through the back. Samuel let him out, bolted the door, and returned to wiping glasses in the dark. Junie arrived at 11. He smelled like cold air and cigarette smoke and the specific tension of a man who has been standing in October for 3 hours in a coat that isn't warm enough. Waiting. He sat in the seat Moretti had just left and leaned forward. "He give you anything useful?" "Some things," Bumpy said. "You trust him?" Bumpy looked at Junie, looked at him the way you look at something you have known so long that you stopped seeing it clearly and are only now, in this specific light, in this specific moment, beginning to see again. Junie Bird. 9 years, every route, every name, every contact. The man who told him the strangers had been on the street a full week before any runner reported them. A full week. "Go home," Bumpy said. "Sleep." Junie studied his face. "You sure you're all right?" "I'm thinking," Bumpy said. "Go home." Junie. After Junie left, Bumpy sat alone in the dark and the smell of old smoke and the silence that comes after a room empties. He took the paper from his breast pocket, read the name one more time, put it back. He already knew what had to happen next. He knew how it had to be done quietly, without telegraphing, without giving the named man any reason to run before the trap was set. The most dangerous moment was the next 12 hours, when he had to behave exactly as he always behaved while knowing exactly what he now knew. Some accounts of what was said in that room have survived in fragments. None of them were written down at the time, and none of them were meant to be. Outside, on 133rd Street, a car rolled past. Slowly. Its headlights swept across the boarded front window of the Starlight and kept moving. Bumpy sat in the dark and did not move. Moretti, years later, when asked about that night, said only that he had never liked that room. When pressed on why, he said nothing further. Some men carry certain rooms with them for the rest of their lives, and Moretti was one of them. It was 4 in the morning when Bumpy's man found Junie Bird, not on a street corner, not in a bar, in the back seat of a car parked on 131st Street, 2 blocks from the building where Bumpy slept, talking to a man that nobody in Harlem was supposed to know. The car's engine was off. No lights. Just 2 men in the dark, leaning close, voices low, with the particular body language of people who understand that what they are saying cannot be heard. Bumpy's man watched from a doorway across the street for 11 minutes. Then he walked to the nearest payphone and called a number he had memorized and never written down. Bumpy answered on the second ring. He listened. He said nothing. He hung up. He was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. They brought Junie to a room on 129th Street, a back room behind a dry goods store, used for different purposes after midnight. The room smelled like turpentine and cardboard, and the sour ghost of old cigarettes embedded in the plaster walls. A single bulb overhead, a wooden chair in the center of the floor, a table pushed against the wall with nothing on it. Junie was already in the chair when Bumpy walked in. He wasn't tied. He wasn't restrained. He sat there voluntarily, which was somehow worse a man who knows that running is not an option and has already made his peace with what comes next. His hands were on his knees. He was looking at the floor. Bumpy stood in front of him for a long time without speaking. The 2 men who had brought Junie stepped back to the walls. Nobody moved. The bulb hummed. Outside, somewhere distant, a bottle broke on pavement and someone laughed once and went quiet. "Look at me," Bumpy said. Junie raised his head. His eyes were red not from crying, from something worse, from the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for too long and has just set it down. "How long?" Bumpy said. Not how could you, not why. Just how long. Junie held his gaze. 6 weeks. Thus, the number landed in the room like something dropped from a height. 6 weeks. While Bumpy had been sitting across from him, eating with him, trusting him with roots and names and the inner mechanics of everything he had built 6 weeks. One of the men against the wall shifted his weight. Bumpy raised one finger without turning around, and the movement stopped. "Tell me everything," Bumpy said. "From the beginning, every meeting, every name, everything you pass to them. You stop talking when you have nothing left to say." Junie talked for 40 minutes. It came out in pieces at first, halting, circling. The way confession always begins when a man is trying to find the version that makes him look least like what he is. Bumpy let him circle. He stood completely still with his hands at his sides and his face closed, and waited until Junie understood that the circling wasn't working and began to talk straight. The man in the car was a contact for an outfit operating out of the Bronx, not Italian, not connected to the syndicate. A freelance operation that had been quietly building a case for moving into Harlem for 2 years. They had approached Junie 4 months ago. They had not threatened him. They had paid him. Cleanly. Consistently. More money than Junie made in 3 months of running Bumpy's streets. They wanted the routes, the collection schedule, the names of the 6 men closest to Bumpy's operation. Junie had given them everything. "The Coffin," Bumpy said. His voice had not changed once in 40 minutes. Same register, same flat. Absolute stillness. "The 6 marks." Junie closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "That wasn't them warning you," he said. "That was them telling you what they already had. Showing you they didn't need to threaten you because they could already take everything from the inside." The room was completely silent. "The 6 marks aren't 6 people they're going to kill," Junie said. His voice cracked for the first time. "They're 6 people they already own. 6 people who've been talking to them, not just me." Bumpy looked at him. "Names?" Junie gave them. All 6. First and last, slowly, clearly, without hesitation, the specific, horrible clarity of a man burning down the last thing he has left in order to survive. When he finished, Bumpy was quiet for a long time. "You told Moretti anything?" he asked. "No." "You tell anyone else you were meeting them tonight?" "No." "You have anything written down anywhere, any record, any money, Any phone number? No. Bumpy nodded slowly. He turned and walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, did not turn around. You stay in this room, he said. You don't make a sound. You don't move until I tell you to move. He walked out. The two men against the wall looked at each other. One of them looked at the door Bumpy had just walked through. Neither of them spoke because there was nothing to say that the room hadn't already said. Junie sat in the chair with his hands on his knees and stared at the floor, and breathed. Outside, Harlem was dark and cold, and completely unaware that in a back room on 129th Street, the thing that could have destroyed it had just been cut open and laid flat. The most dangerous enemy is never the one who threatens you from the outside. It is the one who has sat at your table, eaten your food, and smiled at the right moments for 9 years. What Junie said in that room that night, all of it was never written down. Nobody who was present has ever spoken about it on record. What is known comes from the shape of what happened afterward, and what happened afterward was very clear. Harlem went quiet. Not the quiet of a neighborhood at rest, the quiet of a neighborhood holding its breath, the specific, pressurized silence that settles over a place when the people who understand how things actually work have understood that something is happening, and that speaking about it is not an option. The numbers runners ran their routes. The shop owners opened their doors. Children went to school. Everything moved the way it always moved on the surface, and underneath the surface, nothing moved at all. Bumpy spent the morning alone. He sat in his apartment with the curtains drawn and a cup of coffee that went cold in front of him and the folded piece of paper from Moretti on the table and the 6 names Junie had given him written in his own handwriting on a separate sheet beside it. He looked at the 2 lists. He compared them. They matched. All 6 names, from 2 separate sources who had not spoken to each other, matching perfectly. He picked up his pen. He drew a single line through each name, slowly, deliberately, the way you mark something that has been decided. Then he folded both sheets of paper, lit a match, and burned them in the ashtray. He called Junie at noon. Junie had been in the room on 129th Street for 8 hours. When he answered, his voice had the texture of a man who had not slept and had spent the night with his own thoughts in a small space with no windows, which is one of the more effective forms of punishment available without laying a hand on someone. I need you to do 6 things, Bumpy said, 1 at a time. Exactly the way I tell you. There was a pause. Then, all right. Each of the 6 men needs to be told there's work. Out of the city, Albany, different assignments, different timing, 1 day apart. You tell them personally. You make it sound routine. Another pause. Longer. Bumpy, you want to make this right? Bumpy said, not loud, not threatening. Just a question with 1 correct answer. Yes, Junie said. Then you make 6 calls. 1 per day, starting tonight. He hung up. The first man was contacted that evening. His name was Monroe, and he had been running policy collection on the west side of Harlem for 3 years. Junie called him at 7 and told him there was a job in Albany straightforward. Good money. Leave tomorrow morning. Monroe asked no questions. He said yes. By the following Tuesday, all 6 calls had been made. All 6 men had said yes. All 6 had been given departure times, directions, a point of contact upon arrival. Not one of them arrived. The first disappeared somewhere between Harlem and the Triborough Bridge. The second was last seen at a diner in Yonkers paying for coffee. The third made it as far as a gas station in Tarrytown, where an attendant remembered filling his tank and watching him drive north. After that, nothing. 3, 4, 5, 6 each one, leaving a thin trail of small details that ended abruptly, like a sentence cut off mid-word. A hat left on a diner counter, a car abandoned with the keys still in it, a coat folded neatly over a park bench outside a town that none of them had any reason to visit. No bodies, no reports, no files. Moretti heard the whispers by Wednesday and stopped returning calls. Not from guilt, from the specific professional instinct of a man who understands that there are moments when the wisest thing is to know nothing and be seen to know nothing. He stayed in his apartment in Little Italy, ate his meals alone, and did not pick up the telephone. The shop owners on Lenox Avenue noticed that the strangers who had been collecting money on their blocks had stopped coming. No announcement, no confrontation. They simply were not there anymore, the same way a smell disappears from a room and you can't identify the exact moment it left, only that it's gone. By Thursday, the diner owners and the barbers and the men who ran the betting rooms had begun to talk in very low voices about what they had seen and hadn't seen. They spoke carefully, because Harlem in 1946 was a place where careful men understood that some observations were better left unspoken. Junie came to Bumpy on Thursday evening. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 5 days. He stood in the doorway of Bumpy's apartment and held his hat in both hands, and did not come inside until Bumpy nodded at the chair across the room. "It's done," Junie said. "Yes," Bumpy said. "All of them." "Yes." Junie sat with that for a moment. Then, "What about me?" Bumpy looked at him across the room. Outside the window, Lenox Avenue moved through the early evening light foot traffic, a vendor pushing a cart, 2 women in church clothes walking close together and talking. "You're going to run the West Side routes," Bumpy said. "Monroe's old territory. You're going to do it correctly, and you're going to do it quietly, and every day you do it, you're going to remember why." Junie nodded. He didn't thank him. He understood that gratitude wasn't the appropriate response to what had just been offered, and that the offering was not kindness but utility, and that the distinction mattered. Power is not maintained by guns alone. Sometimes it is maintained by removing certain names from the board before the game can reach its final move. No missing persons report was ever filed for any of the 6 men. Not one family came forward to any precinct in New York City. Some things, in certain communities in 1946, were simply understood to be outside the jurisdiction of official inquiry. By the end of that week, the whole city was waiting for the explosion. Downtown, in the restaurants and back rooms where the Italian outfits conducted their actual business, men were having quiet, careful conversations about what was happening in Harlem. The coffin on Lenox Avenue had been noted. The sudden disappearance of 6 men from Bumpy Johnson's operation had been noted. In that world, those 2 facts added up to one conclusion: Harlem was fracturing. A power vacuum was opening. The question was who would move first. They waited. They watched. They kept their men ready. The explosion never came. Instead, on a Tuesday morning, exactly 9 days after the coffin had been delivered, a word began moving through the network, the specific kind of word that travels between people who need to know things before they become public. The word was simple. Harlem is settled. The problem has been resolved internally. There is nothing to move into because there is no vacuum. There is only Bumpy Johnson and his streets and the specific, permanent fact of both. Nobody could identify where the word originated. It simply arrived, in different conversations, through different channels, spoken by people who each believed they had heard it from someone else first. By Wednesday afternoon, it had reached every level of organized crime in New York City that needed to hear it. The external collectors who had been working Harlem's blocks for the past 2 weeks disappeared overnight. Not gradually, not one at a time. All of them, in a single night, simply stopped appearing. The corners they had been working stood empty. The shop owners they had been pressuring opened their doors on Wednesday morning and looked out at streets that contained none of the faces they had been dreading, and said nothing to each other about it, and got on with their day. Detective O'Malley filed 3 separate reports that week, and then stopped filing. His captain later described the week's paperwork as unusually thin for a period during which, by all accounts, something significant had occurred in the 28th Precinct's coverage area. O'Malley offered no explanation. He closed the relevant folders and moved them to the back of his cabinet and did not open them again. Father Callahan heard 7 confessions on Thursday alone. He sat in the confessional booth in the dim wooden dark and listened and gave penance and said nothing to anyone afterward, because the rules of his profession demanded absolute silence and because some of what he heard that Thursday required it. He walked home that evening in the October dark and stopped once on the sidewalk and stood still for a moment with his hand on a lamppost. Then he kept walking. Carlo Moretti emerged from his apartment on Friday. He made 3 calls from a payphone, careful, brief, coded in the way that men like Moretti always speak when they are not certain who else is listening. Then he sent a single written message to a contact in Harlem. The message was 4 words. It said, "I understand. Well done." He never elaborated. He never asked for details. He understood that the specifics of what had happened were not information he needed or wanted, and that the correct professional response to Bumpy Johnson's resolution of a crisis of this magnitude was to acknowledge it, respect it, and ask nothing further. The Italian outfit from the Bronx, the freelance operation that had spent 2 years and considerable money building its network inside Harlem, went quiet. Their remaining contacts in the neighborhood stopped receiving calls. The money that had been flowing to 6 men inside Bumpy's operation stopped flowing, because the 6 men were no longer anywhere that money could reach them. The outfit's leadership held one meeting about Harlem in the weeks that followed. According to a man who was present and spoke about it decades later in the careful, general terms of someone who understands the statute of limitations on speaking and the permanent absence thereof on being understood as an informant, the meeting was short. The conclusion reached was equally short. Harlem was closed. Bumpy Johnson was to be left entirely alone. Junie ran the West Side routes that week. He came in every evening with his collections, set the money on the table, gave his count, and left. He did not make small talk. He did not linger. He did not mention the 6 names he had given, or the 6 calls he had made, or anything that had happened in the room on 129th Street. He carried it the way men carry the things they have done that cannot be undone quietly. Internally, in a part of themselves, they learn to keep locked. By the end of the week, Lenox Avenue smelled like it always smelled in late October, cold air and exhaust, and the hot, fat smell of a woman frying chicken in an open window on the 4th floor of a building on 122nd, and the faint sweetness of a cigar being smoked on a stoop 2 blocks north. Normal. Completely. Entirely. Permanently. Normal. The most frightening victory is the one that leaves no wreckage, no bodies on the street, no bullet holes in the walls, no screaming and no smoke and no visible evidence that anything happened at all, only the absolute, undeniable fact that the threat is gone, and everyone who needed to understand why is no longer available to explain it. The police reports from that week, several of which were later reviewed by a journalist attempting to reconstruct the timeline, were notable for what they did not contain. Standard precinct activity, routine incidents, nothing that reflected, in any official language, the events that the neighborhood around it had experienced. Some things, in 1946, were simply not written down. The coffin had been sitting in Bumpy's basement for 11 days when he decided it was time to send it back. Not empty. That would have been too simple, too clean. Bumpy Johnson had not survived 20 years in Harlem by making simple, clean gestures. He had survived by making gestures that could not be misunderstood, gestures that arrived like a fist through a wall and left no room for interpretation. He went down to the basement alone at 2 in the morning. The room was cold enough to see his breath. The bulb overhead threw yellow light across the black lacquer surface of the coffin and made the 6 carved marks stand out like wounds. The silver bullet sat on its velvet where it had been since the first night. The room smelled like mold and damp concrete and the fading chemical bite of lacquer going stale in the cold. Bumpy set 6 envelopes on top of the coffin, plain white, sealed. Each one had a name on the front, written in his own handwriting, the 6 men who had taken money to destroy Harlem and had subsequently stopped existing anywhere anyone could find them. Inside each envelope was a single photograph, not of the men, of something far more specific: documentation of every meeting, every handoff, every dollar exchanged, every piece of information sold. Evidence assembled over 3 days of work that Bumpy had done entirely alone, in this same basement, under this same bulb. He placed the envelopes inside the coffin beside the silver bullet, closed the lid, latched it. Then he put his hand flat on the top of the wood, not gently, not with ceremony, just the firm, final contact of a man closing a chapter. He called Moretti at 7 that morning. "I need a truck tonight. Clean. No plates traceable to either of us. And I need you to drive a..." Moretti arrived at 10 with a truck borrowed from a produce company, whose owner had learned years ago that Moretti's favors were best performed without questions. He pulled into the alley behind Bumpy's building and waited in the dark with the engine off. Bumpy came down with Junie and 2 men. They loaded the coffin in 4 minutes. Moving fast. Nobody speaking. The coffin went in heavy dents. Settled. The weight of something that had been decided fully and completely. Moretti looked at the coffin in his rearview mirror after they closed the truck bed. He looked at Bumpy in the passenger seat. He said nothing. He pulled out of the alley and drove south. Junie rode in the back with the coffin in the dark. The truck smelled like old produce and lacquer and cold metal. He could hear the city outside, the sound of tires on wet pavement. A distant radio. Someone shouting in Spanish from a window. He sat with his back against the truck wall and did not look at the coffin and breathed through his mouth. The social club on Mulberry Street was dark at midnight except for one light above the door. That kind of light means someone is awake inside. It always does, in buildings like that. Moretti parked directly in front of the entrance. Bumpy's men unloaded the coffin onto the sidewalk in under 3 minutes, efficient, silent. No wasted movement. The pavement was wet and cold and reflected the street light in long yellow streaks. The coffin sat on the sidewalk of Mulberry Street, enormous and black, directly in front of the door of the man who had sent it north 11 days earlier. Bumpy took out a card, wrote 4 words on the back, set it on top of the coffin lid. Open it. Count them. He got back in the truck. Moretti pulled away from the curb without being told. They were 2 blocks away before anyone inside the club had come to the window. What happened when the coffin was opened reached Bumpy through Moretti's network by the following afternoon. The man inside had sat with the 6 envelopes spread on the table in front of him for a long time, long enough that the 2 men standing in the room with him grew uncomfortable and looked at each other. He opened each envelope, looked at each photograph, set them in a line. He did not speak for 4 full minutes. When he did, it was 1 sentence. The man he said it to never repeated it publicly. What is documented through sources whose accounts have been corroborated across multiple retellings is that the meeting that followed lasted until 4 in the morning. And when it ended, everyone in that room knew exactly what Bumpy Johnson had done and exactly what it meant for them. A bartender who worked 2 doors down on Mulberry Street arrived for his early shift at 5:30 and saw the coffin gone. He thought he had imagined it until 2 other people told him they had seen it too. None of them agreed on exactly when it disappeared. All of them agreed it had been there, and then it wasn't. The most terrifying message is not a threat about what might happen. It is proof of what already has laid out in photographs inside a sealed envelope, inside a returned coffin on your own doorstep before the sun comes up. It says, "I know everything. I have already acted. And I sent this back so you would understand precisely what you are dealing with." The bartender on Mulberry Street talked about that coffin for years. He said it arrived before dawn and was gone before the neighborhood woke up. He said it like a man describing something that still didn't make complete sense to him, even after all that time. The first question came on a Monday. It came from a numbers runner on the west side, a careful man. Experienced. The kind of man who notices when the human furniture of a neighborhood rearranges itself. He mentioned, to no one in particular, that he hadn't seen Monroe in 2 weeks. Said it the way you say something when you're not sure if you're supposed to be saying it. Testing the air. The air said nothing back. By Wednesday, 5 more names were circulating in the same careful, sideways way. Clifford. 2 men from the East Collection route. 2 others whose roles were known to the people who needed to know them. 6 names. 6 faces that had been part of the daily texture of Harlem streets for years. Now simply absent. Not announced absent. Not explained absent. Just gone. The way a tooth goes, the space is there. The surrounding structure is aware of it, and nobody can quite explain when exactly it happened. Bumpy did not say their names. Not once. Not in passing. Not in response to questions. Not in any conversation with anyone. He excised them from his vocabulary with the same thoroughness with which he had burned the paper they were written on. They had existed. They no longer existed. The transition between those 2 states was not a subject he had any interest in discussing. He walked his streets the same way he always had. He ate at the same counter at the same time each morning. He conducted his business with the same flat, unreadable composure that had characterized every interaction he'd had for 2 decades. If anyone was watching him for signs of strain, and people were watching. People are always watching, they found nothing. Junie ran the west side like a man with something to prove. He was at his first collection point at 6 in the morning and his last at 9 at night. He came in with clean numbers every single day, set the money on the table, gave his count in 2 sentences, and left. He did not linger. He did not make conversation. He operated with the focused, humorless efficiency of someone who understands that his continued presence in this world depends entirely on the quality of his work, and has decided to let the work speak for everything. O'Malley received inquiries from 3 directions, 2 families, 1 minister. He met with each one. He took notes in the deliberate, formal way of a man performing the motions of investigation. He opened a folder. He wrote the 6 names across the top of a blank page. He never wrote anything below them. He told the families he was looking into it. He told the minister the same. He filed a single-paragraph report describing 6 individuals whose whereabouts were unknown and whose disappearance showed no evidence of criminal involvement. He used the phrase, "may have relocated voluntarily," twice in 4 sentences. He closed the folder, put it in the back of his filing cabinet, drove home. The man who had sent the coffin, the man whose outfit from the Bronx had spent 2 years and significant money building a network inside Harlem, left New York 3 weeks after the coffin was returned to his doorstep. He did not announce his departure. He did not explain it. His apartment on Arthur Avenue was emptied over a single weekend by men with a truck who worked quickly and did not make eye contact with the neighbors watching from their windows. He went south. Exactly where? Nobody who spoke publicly could confirm. He was simply gone. in the same clean, unannounced way that the 6 men he had recruited were gone. And the parallel was noted in very low voices by very few people, and then not spoken about again. Moretti heard about the departure on a Thursday and said 4 words to his contact. "Good, it's finished." He did not ask where the man had gone. He did not want to know. There are categories of information that experienced men in that world learn to treat like open flames. You acknowledge they exist. You stay a reasonable distance away, and you do not reach for them. The streets of Harlem settled back into their rhythm. The corners that had been worked by outside collectors were worked again by Bumpy's people. The shop owners on Lenox paid what they owed to whom they had always owed it. The numbers moved through the neighborhood the way blood moves invisibly, continuously, sustaining everything. 6 names were gone, 6 spaces in the neighborhood's daily texture where faces used to appear. Now simply empty, no explanation, no resolution, no grave, no file, no final sentence in any official document that accounted for where 6 human beings had gone. The silence around those 6 names was total and permanent and completely understood by everyone who lived in it. Fear built from bodies is temporary. Bodies get found, explained, grieved, filed away. Fear built from disappearance is permanent. It lives in the not knowing in the specific. Freezing uncertainty of understanding that 6 people were there and then were not there, and that the absence has been accepted by everyone around you without a single public word. Nobody ever agreed on where the 6 men went. Not one consistent account emerged from any source at any time. 6 men, 6 different silence, 6 different ways of being gone. That was never an accident. November pressed down on Harlem like a lid. The sky went gray and stayed gray. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 1 week and didn't come back up. Lenox Avenue in the early morning looked like something from a black and white photograph, the cold flattening the light, the steam rising from grates in the pavement, the few people moving at that hour keeping their heads down and their coats pulled tight and their business entirely their own. Bumpy walked the full length of Lenox on a Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock. He walked slowly. He looked at everything: the shop windows, the corners, the faces of the people he passed, the way the street held itself. He stopped at the barber shop, said 3 sentences to the man at the first chair, kept walking, stood at the corner of 125th and Lenox for a full minute and felt the rhythm of the block move around him. It was right. It was exactly right. He could feel it the same way he had felt the wrongness in October, not through thought, but through something older and more reliable. Something in the chest and the gut that had been calibrated by 20 years of standing on these exact streets and paying close enough attention that the neighborhood itself had become a language he could read without effort. Harlem was whole. Still. His. He had spent the previous 2 weeks in meetings that nobody else knew about, careful, unhurried conversations in closed rooms with the men whose territories bordered his. The boundaries were reaffirmed. 3 points of ambiguity that had existed for years were resolved in terms that both sides could accept. Handshakes were made with the weight of men who deal entirely in their word because their word is the only contract that survives what they do. 2 of those meetings involved the Italian side. Moretti arranged both without being asked. He showed up at the right moment with the right introduction, said what needed to be said, and stepped back. After the second meeting, he and Bumpy stood on a cold sidewalk in November dark, and Moretti said 3 words. "It's done. Permanently." Bumpy nodded. They walked in opposite directions. Junie came in one evening with his West Side count and set the money on the table and gave his number. Bumpy looked at the count, looked at Junie. "You're doing it right," he said. Junie said nothing. They both understood that the two-word acknowledgement was as close to full reinstatement as the situation was going to produce, and that it was enough, and that expecting more would be the kind of mistake Junie Bird was no longer in any position to make. O'Malley filed his final report on a Friday afternoon. 4 paragraphs. A disturbance on Lenox Avenue in October. Item removed by persons unknown. No further related incidents. Unauthorized collection activity in the precinct area had ceased. No connection drawn between any events. He signed it without rereading it, put it in the outgoing tray, went home, and did not think about Harlem for the rest of the weekend. Or if he did, he kept it entirely to himself. The coffin was still in the basement. Bumpy had thought about having it removed exactly once, for approximately 90 seconds, and then had decided against it with the same finality he brought to every decision that was actually final. It stayed under the bare bulb in the cold and the damp. The 6 marks were still carved into the lid. The lacquer smell was completely gone now. What remained was just wood and cold, and the faint mineral sharpness of the basement itself, which was old and had held other things before this, and would hold other things after. 2 men in the building knew the coffin was there. They didn't discuss it with each other or with anyone else. The woman who cleaned the building had been told the basement was off limits and had processed that information the way intelligent people in Bumpy's orbit processed such instructions immediately, completely, and without the kind of curiosity that creates problems. The coffin sat in the dark, a physical fact, permanent, silent, immovable, not a trophy. Bumpy Johnson was not a man who kept trophies because trophies are for men who need to be reminded of what they've won. This was something different. This was a weight, a record of what October had cost and what it had required, and how close Harlem had come to being taken apart from the inside by people who had been trusted with everything. A gambler who ran a dice game on 121st Street said years later that he had been shown the coffin once. He said someone took him down there in the context of explaining something important, and he stood in front of it in the cold yellow light and looked at the 6 marks and understood the lesson without it being explained. He said he looked at it for maybe 30 seconds. He said he didn't go back to that building for 6 months. He said he believed it was still down there. Years later, that nothing had moved it, that it was just sitting in that basement in the dark, the same way it had been sitting there since November of 1946, waiting for nothing, because it didn't need to wait, because it had already done everything it needed to do, simply by existing. Nobody confirmed that. Nobody denied it either. True power does not announce itself. It does not hold press conferences or fire warning shots or explain its reasoning to the people it has outmaneuvered. It simply is present, certain, permanent. It is the city knowing what happened without being told. It is the right people stepping carefully around the right subjects without needing to be warned. It is streets that run correctly and money that moves cleanly, and a neighborhood that holds its shape because the person holding it has demonstrated, once, completely and without theatrics, exactly what the cost of challenging that shape will be. The gambler said the coffin was still there. He said it like a man describing something sacred or something cursed. In Harlem, those two things were often the same. The truck was never found. The 6 names faded from conversation, the way smoke fades from a room slowly, completely, until the air held no trace that they had ever been there at all. Harlem stayed. Bumpy Johnson's, not because he was the fastest with a gun, but because every person on every block understood something about him, that no bullet could communicate that by the time trouble announced itself. He had already finished dealing with it, quietly, permanently, without a single word spoken in public. Somewhere beneath a building on Lenox Avenue, a black coffin sits in the dark with 6 marks carved into its lid. It has never been moved. It has never been explained. It doesn't need to be. If stories like this stay with you, the ones that never made the history books, The ones that lived in back rooms and closed files, and the careful silence of men who knew better than to talk. Then you already know why this channel exists. Subscribe if you haven't. Every story we tell is the one they tried to bury. Now tell us what you think. If someone sent you a coffin with your name carved inside, would you run? Or would you send it back? And which man in this story do you respect most? And which one would you never trust?